Have you ever wondered why, despite decades of obsessive searches and increasingly advanced technology, practically no buried pirate treasure has ever been found? The answer might shock you, because they rarely buried their treasures the way Hollywood made us believe. Forget everything you've seen in movies. Forget the maps with a big X marking the spot, deserted islands, and chests overflowing with gold coins. The reality of pirates and their treasures is far more fascinating and disturbing than any fiction could imagine. To understand how pirates really dealt with their wealth, we need to go back to the 17th century, when the Caribbean seas swarmed with ships loaded with Spanish gold and spilled blood. But before we dive into this dark story, let me ask a question that might completely change your perspective. If you were a pirate in the year 1680, had just looted a Spanish galleon, and your hands were full of gold, what would be the first thing you'd do? If your answer was bury the treasure on a deserted island, then you thought exactly like a 21st century landlubber, not like a 17th century pirate. The truth is, pirates were above all practical men. They lived precarious, violent, and uncertain lives. Death hovered at every battle, every storm, every risky decision. Why the hell would they bury their only source of financial security in a place they might never find again? But then comes an even more intriguing question. If they didn't bury their treasures, why did this legend become so deeply rooted in our culture? The answer takes us to one of the most extraordinary and least known stories of the golden age of piracy. It all started with a man named William Kidd, and his story is so bizarre, it seems like it came straight out of a Gothic novel. Kidd wasn't an ordinary pirate. In fact, he didn't even consider himself one. He was a privateer licensed by the English government to hunt French pirates in the Indian Ocean, but fate had other plans for him. In 1699, after years sailing dangerous waters and making questionable decisions, Kidd found himself in a desperate situation. He had been declared a pirate by the very authorities who had hired him, and he knew the gallows awaited if he were captured. That's when he made a decision that would forever change our perception of pirate treasures. Kidd really did bury part of his treasure. But here's the detail no one tells you. He didn't do it out of romance or pirate tradition. He did it out of pure political desperation. Kidd buried his treasure on Gardiner's Island near Long Island as a bargaining chip. He planned to use the treasure's location to negotiate his freedom with the English authorities. "Let me live," was essentially his proposal, "and I will give you gold." The strategy didn't work. Kidd was executed in London in 1701, but his story spread like wildfire. Suddenly, everyone believed all pirates buried their treasures. One exceptional case became the rule in popular imagination. But if most pirates didn't bury treasures, what did they really do with their wealth? The answer reveals a side of piracy rarely discussed, its deeply human and ironically civilized nature. Pirates spent their money immediately, compulsively, desperately. Imagine living knowing each day could be your last, that every battle might end in your death, that every port might be where you are finally captured and hanged. In those circumstances, does it make sense to save for the future, or does it make more sense to live intensely every moment you have? Pirates chose the latter, and they did so spectacularly. When a pirate ship docked in Tortuga, Port Royal, or Nassau, the great hubs of Caribbean piracy, the party started before their feet even touched solid ground. They spent fortunes on rum, gambling, prostitutes, and gear. They bought extravagant clothes, flashy jewelry, and ornate weapons. Not because they were vain, but because they knew the money in their pocket today was worth more than any promise of future wealth. But there was something even more revealing about how pirates handled money. They divided it immediately after every raid, following strictly established codes that would make any modern lawyer jealous. These pirate codes, real, documents that have survived to this day, specified exactly how the loot was to be divided. The captain received a larger share, as did the navigator and the surgeon. But even the common pirate got his fair portion at the moment of division. There was no banking system, no savings, no retirement plans. Each man got his share and did, with it, what he pleased. This leads us to a fascinating question. If pirates spent everything immediately, how do we explain the occasional treasures found over the centuries? The answer lies in a practice much more common than burying treasure, but far less romantic: temporary stashing. Pirates often hid small amounts of money during their travels, not as permanent treasure, but as emergency reserves. If the ship was captured, if they needed to flee quickly, or if an unexpected buying opportunity arose, these small caches could be quickly accessed. These stashes were made in practical places, inside the ships themselves, in caves near frequented ports, or buried shallowly near freshwater sources where they knew they would return. They were not epic treasures meant to last generations. They were emergency funds meant to last weeks or months. Many of these small stashes were simply forgotten when their owners died in battle or were executed. Others were recovered by the pirates themselves and spent in the usual way. A few remained lost and were eventually found by archaeologists and treasure hunters, further fueling the legend of buried treasure. But there is a category of pirate treasure that defies all these practical explanations, and its story is as sinister as it is fascinating. In 1984, marine archaeologists discovered the remains of the Queen Anne's Revenge, the ship of the infamous Blackbeard, off the coast of North Carolina. What they found were not chests of gold or piles of silver coins. Instead, they uncovered something far more revealing about the true nature of piracy: primitive medical equipment, sophisticated navigation instruments, and, most disturbingly, evidence of practices suggesting some pirates had very different methods of storing their wealth. Blackbeard, whose real name was Edward Teach, didn't bury gold in the traditional sense. He invested in terror. Every act of brutal violence, every public display of cruelty, every legend spreading about his ferocity was like depositing money in a bank of fear. The more people feared him, the less resistance he encountered. And less resistance meant more loot gained with less effort. This was perhaps the most sophisticated form of pirate investment, turning reputation into currency. But Blackbeard was not alone in this strategy. Pirates like Black Bart Roberts, Anne Bonny, and Calico Jack understood that in the economy of piracy, perception was more valuable than physical gold. A feared pirate could capture a ship simply by brandishing his black flag. An unknown pirate had to fight to the death for every coin. This brings us to one of the most shocking discoveries about pirate treasures. Some of the greatest treasures never physically existed. They were carefully cultivated myths by the pirates themselves to increase their value in the terror market. Consider the story of Calico Jack Rackham. His exploits were legendary, his treasures supposedly vast. But when he was finally captured, in 1720, the authorities were shocked to find he possessed very little real gold. His true wealth lay in the legend he had built around himself, a legend that allowed him to intimidate merchant ships without even fighting. This discovery reveals something profound about pirate psychology. They instinctively understood something that took centuries to formalize in modern economics: that perceived value can be more powerful than actual value. But if most pirates did not hoard physical treasures, where did all the wealth looted from? The New World really end up? The answer leads us to the true beneficiaries of the golden age of piracy: the merchants, tavern keepers, blacksmiths, prostitutes, and suppliers of pirate ports. They were the unofficial bankers of the pirate world, converting stolen gold into goods and services. Port Royal, Jamaica, became one of the richest cities in the world in the 17th century, not because its inhabitants were pirates, but because they were the recipients of pirate money. Every Spanish gold coin a pirate spent on rum, every silver piece traded for gunpowder, every jewel used to pay for ship repairs, all of it flowed through the local economy like blood through veins. When Port Royal was destroyed by an earthquake in 1692, it wasn't just a city swallowed by the waves, it was the greatest pirate treasure in history, distributed not in buried chests, but in the foundations, walls, and vaults of an entire metropolis. This leads to an even more intriguing question. If we know pirates didn't bury their treasures in the traditional way, why do we keep looking for them? The answer may lie with William Kidd himself, and a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Remember that Kidd was executed in 1701, and that his treasure buried on Gardiner's Island was recovered by the authorities? Well, that's only part of the story. Historical records suggest Kidd may have buried other treasures in locations he took to the grave. not out of pirate tradition, but for a much darker reason. Documents recently uncovered in the British National Archives suggest Kidd may have been the victim of a political conspiracy. Some of the most powerful men in London, including members of Parliament, may have secretly funded his operations, hoping to profit from his plunders. When Kidd became a political liability, these same men may have orchestrated his downfall. If true, then any treasure Kidd buried was not just gold and silver, it was evidence that could destroy political careers and expose corruption at the highest levels of the English government. Kidd was clever enough to realize he was being betrayed. He may have buried not only treasures but documents, letters, contracts, records proving the involvement of his powerful patrons. If those documents exist, they represent a very different kind of treasure. Truths that certain people would pay any price to keep buried. This theory would explain why, even after more than 300 years, the search for Kidd's treasures continues. Treasure hunters aren't just after gold. They seek the key to one of the greatest political scandals in English history. But there is another aspect of the reality of pirate treasures that defies all our romantic assumptions, and it concerns the very nature of what we consider treasure. When we think of pirate treasures, we imagine gold and silver. But for a 17th century pirate, the real treasure was often far more mundane and far more valuable. Spices, medicines, tools, fine fabrics, navigational instruments, even books could be worth more than their weight in gold. A pirate surgeon with a full set of medical instruments was more valuable to a crew than any amount of coins. A navigator with accurate sea charts could mean the difference between life and death. A carpenter with quality tools could keep a ship running for years. These practical treasures were rarely buried because they were in constant use. But when occasionally hidden, they were guarded far more carefully than any gold. And when found by modern archaeologists, they often go unnoticed because they neither glitter nor catch attention. This leads to a disturbing possibility. What if some of the greatest pirate treasures have already been found, but we don't recognize them as such? In 1996, archaeologists discovered the remains of a pirate ship off the coast of Madagascar. Among the recovered artifacts were extremely sophisticated navigational instruments, far more advanced than anything a common pirate should have possessed. They also found evidence of advanced medical knowledge and metallurgical techniques that should not have existed in the Indian Ocean at that time. These pirates were not just sea thieves, they were innovators, inventors, preservers of knowledge. Their true treasures were not gold and silver, but information, techniques, and wisdom they gathered from all the cultures they encountered. This knowledge was their most guarded treasure, and unlike gold, it was something they truly buried. In the minds of their successors, in the hidden designs of their ships, in the secret codes they used for communication. Some historians now believe that certain maritime innovations attributed to respectable sailors may have originally been developed by pirates. The irony is delicious. The same men society considered the scourge of the seas may have been responsible for advances that benefited all humanity. But perhaps the most surprising truth about pirate treasures is this: the greatest treasure they left behind is not buried on any island, not hidden in any cave, and cannot be found by metal detectors. It's right here, right before our eyes. Pirates gave us something far more valuable than gold. They gave us the idea of radical freedom. In an era when most people were born and died in the same social condition, pirates created societies where a former slave could become a captain, where decisions were made democratically, where competence mattered more than birth. They developed codes of conduct that included compensation for work injuries, equal division of resources, and even primitive forms of life insurance. Many of these ideas wouldn't become common in civilized society for another 200 years. When pirates gathered in Nassau, Tortuga, or Madagascar, they created communities that functioned as radical social experiments. They were places where race, nationality, and social class mattered less than skill and courage, where laws were made by the inhabitants themselves, not imposed by distant monarchs. These social experiments were the true treasures of the golden age of piracy. And unlike gold, which can be spent, or silver, which can tarnish, these ideas continue to grow in value over time, So next time you hear a story about pirates burying treasure, remember, they really did bury something valuable. Not gold or silver, but seeds of ideas that keep germinating to this day. And maybe, just maybe, there are still pirate treasures waiting to be discovered. Not on the beaches of tropical islands, but in dusty archives, forgotten diaries, and undeciphered codes left behind by these extraordinary men and women, because in the end, pirates understood something that took us a long time to learn. The true treasure isn't what you bury, but what you let grow. And that might be the most valuable lesson of all.